Good morning, everyone, and I'm glad that you're joining me again in our devotional series and our time through the book of James. This actually brings up a thought that I had as I'm going into this. We're going to finish James chapter 4 this morning, so then we only have one chapter left. And I'm imagining that with the time frame and the way things have been going so far, most likely we'll finish James 5 and be done with the book. And so I'm not sure exactly where we might be able to go next. So this is where you come into play. I would love to hear your suggestions, your input on maybe a favorite New Testament book that you enjoyed. And perhaps you'd like us to go through in a devotional series like this. If you have a suggestion like that, I'd love for you to email me through the church web, if you have my email address or whatnot, through music@doorwaybc.com. Or if you got my number, text me, call me, whatever. I'd like to hear what's on your heart and what might be beneficial for you as we think about the future and think about where we might go next in our time together as we spend time in the Word together. Hope these have continued to help you and encourage you. I know I've definitely been enjoying studying these. But let's get into the text this morning. We're going to finish James chapter 4, and I'm going to do verses 13 to the end of the chapter. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Now, if you remember in our previous time together, I said that in the latter part of this chapter, James is illustrating this self-centered living, this self-centered attitude even further, and he does that in two different ways. In our last bit of time together, we talked about how this self-centeredness manifests itself in slandering and judging other people, being willfully defiant to God's command to love others as yourself. And now in this morning's passage, we're going to see how self-centered living, selfish desires, they also play out in our refusal to consider God's will for our lives as we go about and as we plan our days. I fear this is a common problem that we all have. It's easy for us to plan our days, to plan our lives, even down to the smallest detail. You've got some people that, plan things down to the hour and the moment. Some people are just, we'll figure it out as we go. Those people frustrate me at times because I'm a planner. I like to know what's going on and when it's going to happen. We put dates on the calendar. We plan the financial situations, or if we, hey, if I get this amount of money, I'm going to pay this debt off, or I'm going to get this bill taken care of, or so forth. We plan our vacations, all kinds of things. And I know you and I have both experienced, perhaps in more than one time in the last few months with this whole worldwide pandemic, that plans can easily get changed. And so it's easy for us in the hustle and bustle of planning, of organizing, of trying to map out our lives, that we can forget God's will. We can forget God entirely and not even include Him in the equation. And very often, those are the kind of acts that make us look like we say we believe in God, but then we act like He doesn't exist. I like the way Craig Groeschel puts it. He calls it Christian atheism. It's an intentional oxymoron that we claim to be followers of Christ, but yet we live in a way that kind of says we don't think He exists. And it's a sad position to be in. So we pretend that God is unimportant to us and how we live. We act in that way, and we can do this overtly in the way we act or the things we say, but we can also be more subtle about this when we refuse to seek His face, to seek His will, to ask what He wants us to do as we are guided in our walk, in our daily walk, just our lives in general. So look at verse 13 here. It says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money." That doesn't sound like a bad thing, though. In fact, there's even some conjecture here in this passage over who James is talking about. Some people want to say, oh, well, he's talking to businessmen who aren't really claiming to be believers, and that's the issue going on there. So then it raises the question, so are these unbelievers or are these believers? And I think it would be easy for us to understand that based on the context. Remember, we always want to look at what's going on around us, as we would have learned and understood even from Dr. Beck in our other Bible studies together, that what James is saying here, I would definitely lean to the fact that he is speaking to fellow believers, especially since he's been using all of chapter 4 here to deal with this theme, this issue of selfishness and how it relates to all areas of our lives for Christians. Because the whole point in James talking about all this is to say, these things don't belong. If you're a follower of Christ, this shouldn't be happening. So, but like I said, on the surface, and you read this verse 13, it doesn't seem like they're doing anything wrong. I mean, trade is a common practice in Palestine. Trade is common practice today, and a lot of times those who go through the greatest risks can often be the ones that yield the highest reward. Now, farming also would have been very common back then, but then trade also would have been a much more aggressive kind of business practice. And so here's these guys that are venturing into the market, and what verse 13 is showing us, they have it all figured out. They have planned a time to leave, a place to go, what they're going to do, how long they're going to stay there, and when they're going to come back. That sounds pretty well thought out, pretty well laid out. And again, on the surface, it doesn't sound like anything's wrong, except notice what's missing. What's missing in this verse is, as James is giving this illustration, there is nothing, there is no nod or assent to the fact that God is sovereign over all. They don't include God in any of this. There's no regard to God's will in their lives in this planning. They have literally taken their own lives into their hands and decided what they are going to do, and they don't have any regard for what God may want them to do or may want them to accomplish as they explore these new business ventures. Hey, listen, this is what I want to do. This is how I'm going to do it. This is when I'm going to do it. And that's it. There's no, what does God want me to do? How does God want me to do it? How can I glorify God even in this business venture? None of those things are said. And so then you have the follow-up in verse 14. Verse 14 says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." So in verse 14, he quickly comes to his readers and says, I'm going to give you a couple warnings about this here. First, James points out, listen, that's a terrible way to act and think, and here's why. The first issue is you don't know the future. We can't just assume that the sun will always rise, that we will always see a new day, and take for granted the daily life and the breath that God gives us. I mean, it's presumptuous and it's selfish for us to think and act this way. How many of us knew, let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. How many of us knew that we would be spending these next few months dealing with a worldwide pandemic and our entire culture would shift in light of this invisible enemy that we're dealing with? And just when we thought it was getting better, then it seems to be getting worse, whether that's inflated by the media or not. Now there's other protocols and practices that we have to put into place. Never in my life would I imagine that I'd be walking around in this country with a mask on. We don't know the future. That's what I'm getting at. And it worse, when we act like these guys in verse 13, we're acting like we're not as knowledgeable as God is. And then when we plan out our days, that we can just act and think however we want. So that's James's first warning. Listen, you don't know the future. So don't act and plan and pretend that you do. Have a a looseness in how you plan things. This is my intention, which we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but here's my intention, but if it changes, that's okay. It's not just like taking everything under your own control and I'm in charge. I'm at the stern of this ship here. So here's James' second warning in verse 14. He's reminding us that in light of this grand timeline of eternity, past, present, future, our life is but a vapor. I heard this verse quoted all the time as a kid, referring to the brevity of life and how, what we need to do needs to matter for Jesus. The old poetic gesture, only one life will soon be past, only what's done for Christ will last. And that would be hand in hand with this passage here in James 4. But when you look at our lives, and I'm talking about 70, 80, 90 plus years old lives, and everything in between, in light of eternity, our lives are just a blip on the map. I mean, the flicker of a light and it's gone. Even if we were to live to these older ages, it's like a few seconds in comparison. And James wants to soberly remind us that life is uncertain and it's brief. I mean, look around you and you will see lives which have been cut short before we would imagine that those people would be gone from us. Young children, teenagers, young adults, so forth. I mean, our own church, for those that are watching, you know of the hurt and the grief that we went through as a church when we lost a young man who was in his senior year of high school. It catches us off guard. Life is brief. We don't know how many days we're given. And why is James pointing all this out? Because his goal here, his desire, which should be our goal and desire, is that we would make the most out of the precious time God has given us. To redeem the time, as Paul says, because the days are evil. We all have busy schedules. I get that. We all have things we need to get done. We work, we take care of our families. There are things that dig into our schedules. We have to carve out time for those things. I mean, even the mundane things of the world, like maintaining our houses and cutting our grass, that kind of stuff. There's things that we have to do constantly. And I'm not negating any of those things. We have dreams, we have desires. Some people go into business for themselves. They have these, or how they want life to look when they retire and so forth. Those aren't necessarily bad things, about what we want to do with our personal time and so forth. But what I'm saying is, what James is saying is, God desires for us to put His will first as we work on these things. Listen, we don't have the right to plan out our days as if we're in charge. God is. He's the one who redeemed us. He's the one who forgives us and gives us sustaining grace for the moments. So He needs to be in charge. As we seek to guide our steps, as we make plans, it's not the plans that are bad necessarily, but are we making those plans and desiring to see God glorified? Are we bringing them to the feet of Jesus and saying, listen, you order my steps. These are my wishes, these are my desires, but guess what? Psalm 37:4, we delight ourselves in the Lord, and He gives us the desires of our heart. What does that mean? Again, which many of us probably know, our desires become His desires. God, what do you want out of my life? How can my life glorify you? Sure, we can think those things. We can push ourselves in that direction, even as we do something like planning vacation or wanting to go into some kind of business venture or practice. God, how can we glorify you in this decision? Do you want us to do this now? Is this what you want us to do? So the heart of the matter is that we need to make His will what comes first before we plan our goals and desires. Because again, it's not about us. This whole chapter has been against this self-centered, selfish living. But now let's look at verse 15. Instead, you ought to say, so now James is going to give the contrast, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. So just to make sure he doesn't leave them all hanging, he's going to help them out. He's going to put the positive spin here on the situation. Hey, listen, I told you about the problem in verse 13, 14. Now let me give you a scenario of how it looks like in light of submissiveness to God's will and to his plans and purposes. Let me show you what that looks like. So then we have verse 15. James says, if it's the Lord's will, we will do this or that. And you see the difference? Notice that difference. No longer is it about, hey, listen, I'm going to do A, B, C, and D. And who is God? I mean, why do I need to include him in any of this? But instead, these people are seeking his face and saying, God, if this is what you want me to do, if this is something you're going to allow me to do, then these are my plans. But guess what? God, you have supreme authority. You can change anything on there you want. I'm okay with that. We should be okay with that. This is a direct contrast to verse 13. One of the things that I've developed in my own life is you may often hear me say, Lord willing, and then I say, this is going to happen in the future. Lord willing, I'm going to fly here. Lord willing, I'm going to do this week. Or, and I'm not saying that you need to adopt that, but what I'm saying is I've been convicted of that over the years, and I know my own heart. I know the pride in me that wants to take charge, and it shouldn't. That helps me. It helps kind of be the check that helps me to remember I don't need to be in charge. It's not a magical formula. I'm not saying you say this and now all of a sudden everything's going to be different. But I have developed the habit of saying, Lord willing, these are my plans. And I do that because I want to remind myself that I want God's desire for my life. If God is allowing me to do such and such, Lord willing, I'm going to pursue seminary. Lord willing, this fall, I'm pursuing doctoral studies. If God provides, that is what I'm going to do. But guess what? If God chooses not to provide, then it's not something I'm going to pursue because I want his will to be done. I don't want to get selfish and pursue my own personal agenda at the risk of missing out on the blessings of obedient living. And I'm not saying I'm perfect in any of that, but I'm just trying to illustrate the idea that as we start to align ourselves with what God wants us to do, as we start to try to change the way we think about and focus our attention, I have made too much of a mess in my own life by trying to think and act like I have it all together. And maybe you can relate to that. To pretend that I know all these things and I can truly do what's best for me. I'm just fooling myself. How dumb for me to actually think that. And James is saying to us here in verse 15, listen, put God first. Make your plans, that's okay. But make sure that your plans have open hands that express to God, God, this is what I'm thinking about doing. This is what I'd like to do. However, I am completely okay with you changing any or all of these things if that's not what's best for me. Friends, that's humility. That's worship. That's responding rightly to God. Now let's look at the last part of this chapter, verse 16. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin to them. So again, here's the point he's making. Verse 16 says, you boast in your arrogant schemes. Our pride will blind us so badly to God's will and his plan for our lives, something that is far greater, far sweeter than we can imagine. Why? Because we want to live for ourselves rather than for the glory of God. And James says this kind of boasting, this kind of attitude that you've got it all together, that you can figure your own life out, that you don't need other people's help, that you don't need to submit to God and his will, whether you say it overtly or you say it in the way you live, it's pure evil. Hey, listen, you think you can brag about how you have it all together, how you make plans without needing any help? You are bringing shame on the name of Jesus Christ. Who are you, wretched sinner? Were you not this hell-bound, undeserving person who received the grace of God? Who are you now to think that you are something that's any better now? Like you've magically arrived at some new level of living. But for the grace of God, you would not be where you are today. I would not be where I am today. And so James concludes chapter 4 here by saying, for those of you that know the good things you ought to do and you don't do them, it's sin. Now, you've probably heard at some point about how there are sins of commission, things that we do overtly, and sins of omission, things that we do by refraining. That's what he's saying here. We fail to live obediently to the Lord when we choose not to do the things we know God wants us to do. It's not enough that we don't lie or steal or covet, things that people might see. It's just as bad when we don't worship, when we don't share the gospel, when we don't love our neighbor as ourselves. And a lot of those things stem from a heart attitude issue. You see, I think James is making it pretty clear for us that as we've worked our way through chapter 4, that self-centered living is not really living at all. Now, it may feel like that for a while. You may think that it's fun and enjoyable, but it robs us of the wonderful blessings of God, the sweet fellowship that we can enjoy, because we're essentially being idolaters. We are replacing God with ourselves. It hinders our prayer life, he pointed out. It causes us to judge and slander other people. It certainly is not God's desire for our lives, and it demands our full repentance, our forsaking it so that we can delight in him. And so make plans, but let's put God first in those plans. Let me leave you with these words from the Westminster Catechism. As this catechism is designed of several different questions, the very first question in the catechism says, what is the chief end of man? To which the appropriate response is, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. I think that summarizes pretty well what James has been trying to get across to us throughout this chapter. Friends, I want to thank you for being with me, and we'll begin looking at chapter 5 again in our time together next time.